the Daily Express, the Independent, the Financial Times, the Times, the Guardian.
Are you hopeful that there will even be a reckoning?
An infuriating dereliction of duty. And the media's played a role in sustaining Israel's narrative. The repeat offender in the UK is the BBC. The media it has a very carefully crafted strategy of drip feeding information and distorting the reality so that you don't connect the dots. But for the Palestinians, it's a completely different rule book. They use a passive voice, they omit context, they make sure that the reality isn't painted.
Every conscientious person who follows the daily harrowing scenes on social media cannot understand why there is a lack of anger in Western capitals, and to be frank, with many who we interact with. We Muslims have become accustomed to living dual lives at the best of times, where we witness the daily abuses against our ummah, but live in societies that are not only oblivious to the suffering, but often find the resulting sadness and anger to be a product of an overactive imagination. But I think it is fair to say this past year has been particularly difficult. We live lives of sadness punctuated by a wedding, birthday, or a celebration that, alhamdulillah, pulls us temporarily away from our melancholy. But how did society get here? How has genocide become so normalized? And what is the role of Western media in manufacturing consent? Now, to help us unpick the relationship between Western foreign policy and the mainstream media, I have the pleasure of hosting on my show, The Thinking Muslim, investigative journalist Hamza Yusuf. Hamza Yusuf is a British-born Palestinian writer and journalist whose work focuses on Palestine. He has reported on daily life under occupation for Palestinians, including home demolitions and forced expulsions, and the condition of Palestinians in Israeli prisons. He's an investigative journalist at Declassified, amongst other publications. Hamza Yusuf, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to The Thinking Muslim.
Maalaikum salam, pleasure to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us, Hamza. And I know this has been a long time coming, and we've tried to arrange this interview, and for all sorts of reasons, we haven't really, got a chance to speak to one another. But in a way, this is an apt time because we're recording this just after the year of genocide, and we've just seen this outpouring of emotions, possibly in the Western press, on what happened on the 7th of October. And a lot of us just look at that and think, this is, it's pretty disproportionate. And so something is happening in the media, and we see the hypocrisy. I'm really relying on you today to try to give us a glimpse of what is happening as a journalist, and how does the media manufacture consent in the masses. Now, let me start with this evocative video I saw sent out by, amongst others, the president of Turkey, Erdogan. And it was a video showing that in 2050, the world will lament, the Western world in particular will lament this genocide. Where was I? Where were you on the genocide? I think the young child asks the parents. Now, I'm pretty skeptical whether that actually will happen in the West in particular. But let's just talk about the narrative. You're responsible partly in developing the narrative. Why has the narrative not consolidated that there is a genocide taking place in Gaza?
Because the people financing and enabling it unconditionally ultimately control the narrative. I agree with you. I don't think that the term genocide will be accepted, certainly not by those, in Germany, the UK, the United States, those who are arming, financing and enabling this. But I think that the premise of the question should stand. That should be the defining question of our age. Where were you? What were you doing? And we shouldn't let politicians, media organizations, state institutions rewrite history on their terms. When they stand up in 15 years' time in the Commons and read out these commemorations and read out and pay tribute to what happened with these tragic stories, that will come out and will be retold, and these stories will be told countless times.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that those people are not rehabilitated, that we know their role, we know the role they played. There was a time to act. That time to act is now. It has been a time to act for the last year. And so when people ask, we always say never forget, never forgive, because we are witnessing, this is the most documented genocide, the most documented crime of our age. And there's a lot of people who have enabled it. And that question should be, the litmus test. We should be asking all of them, what were you doing? Where were you? What did you do? Did you do enough, or did you just look on with indifference? And the bulk of the people, I think, like I said, it expands across media, politics, across the board. A lot of them are complicit. They have manufactured consent for this. They've enabled this, and we need, like we said, we can't simply just let it go by.
I just wonder. I mean, we said the same after the Iraq War, and it was an invasion on false pretenses. But you got people like Alistair Campbell, who today are there have been their images have been whitewashed and they have been rehabilitated, and it's as if 1 million Iraqis who died as a result of that invasion don't really matter. I mean, are you hopeful that there will even be a reckoning in these societies, especially amongst the elites, as to what's happened and happening in Gaza?
We've seen throughout history that the answer instinctively is no.
Yeah.
But I guess that's up to us. We have to apply the pressure. We have seen a level of organising, a level of mobilisation at the grassroots level, and it has been collective action that has, ensured this is the front of people's priorities. But in terms of the political elites, they haven't historically ever had any contrition. They haven't been, rightly held to account. Many have passed away. We've had the deaths of people like Kissinger and all the rest of them who passed away with nothing. There were no consequences. In the end, they lived full lives, and in the end, they weren't properly held to account. I suspect a lot of people, Joe Biden, will probably follow in the same way. Yeah, these people should be in The Hague. They should be. They have enabled war crimes. They have enabled a massacre. They have enabled genocide, without a shadow of a doubt. That is the correct term to use in Gaza. But as I said, it's unfortunately up to us. In a world that functions properly, international law should mean something. Yeah, and these tribunals and these courts should stand for something. Yeah. So far, the answer is unfortunately no. Yeah, now I've asked you here today as a journalist to talk about this disconnect we feel when we see this tragedy taking place almost hour by hour, minute by minute on our mobile phones, yet the people around us are completely oblivious to what's happening here. Before we analyse that, just to lay out what you observe of the mainstream media. An infuriating dereliction of duty. I'm witnessing, for me, I see it as a crystallization of what the media exists to do. This is its function. It's there to preserve the status quo. It's not there to provide you with the reality. It's not there to inform. It's there to misinform, ultimately. People often, they have these, they say you must keep up with the news, otherwise you'll be uninformed. Actually, you keep up with the news, you'll be misinformed. And I think the media, there should be no doubts after this. The media's played a role in sustaining Israel's narratives, ensuring Israel is told the tale of the genocide on its terms, and not the terms of the Palestinians who are the victims of this. It's ensured that there's a narrative that's been sustained and perpetuated throughout. And so the media, for me, has just its role and its function. It's a cog in the system, and that's been reinforced in the last year. And I think that should be under no doubt. To watch it unfold in real time, to watch how the headlines are, to watch who is interviewed and how they're interviewed, and how it differs according to where you are, what side you're on. That has been infuriating to watch. And from places where you expect better, there is, I think, no right or left in this. There is, when you talk about media, you talk about BBC, Sky, for example, Guardian, Washington Post, New York Times. People would often say they're on different sides of the spectrum. I think there is one spectrum. When it comes to Israel and the media, there is one spectrum. They are all operating on the same wavelength. They use the same playbook. And unfortunately, like I said, with people, the poison they've pumped out into the mainstream in the last 12 months, it's people are overdosing on it. It's polluting people's minds. And it's, like I said, watching it in real time has been, you watch something in disbelief at the way that's been covered. You see on social media the reality, you see the clips that come out, and then you see how it's reported. And it's, and how is it reported? Give us a glimpse. So there's numerous examples. The repeat offender in the UK is the BBC. Right. So you have a few examples come to mind. There was the 4-day-old twins that were killed as their father went to get their birth certificates, incidentally. He'd come back and they'd been killed by an Israeli airstrike. And that was described as just baby twins killed in Gaza. Killed by who? Was it an Israeli airstrike? What was it? It's left to be ambiguous. When the BBC headline was fixed, I suspect due to pressure, then it became father says newborn twins killed by Israeli airstrike. In other words, they're adding the deniability. They add this version. It becomes a version of events. It doesn't become the fact. And obviously we have the comparison with how recent events have been highlighted and reported on in the media with the strikes on Tel Aviv. A few other examples. There was a case of the young guy with Down syndrome in Gaza, and he was mauled to death. The military combat dogs were unleashed by Israeli forces on him, and they savaged him to death. And the BBC again reported it as the lowly death of a man with Down syndrome in Gaza. So as if this happened, it just happened. It was just unfortunate, the circumstances we're unaware of. And again, when they then added in the details in the headlines, when it was edited and changed, then they said, "Mother tells BBC."
Yeah.
So they keep adding this deniability. They keep making it your word against mine. They make sure not to present it in the vivid categorical terms.
Yes.
And that's all part of the context, right? The media has a very carefully crafted strategy of drip feeding information and distorting the reality so that you don't connect the dots, right? You're not reaching the logical conclusion that Israel is a settler colonial state. It's been terrorizing and oppressing the Palestinians for almost a century. Its latest form is right and uncompromising genocide. You won't reach those conclusions. The media is there to allow you to view things from a very distorted lens, and you have a diluted understanding. There was a really important report by the Centre for Media Monitoring under the Muslim Council of Britain, which looked at 1 month of media coverage, so about 170,000 online clips broadcast and about 25,000 online articles.
Yeah.
So just short of 200,000, different case studies and examples. And you just look at one thing which is striking. We talk about context and adding the full picture. There were 98,000 mentions of the word Gaza in broadcast in the first month.
Really?
Only 26 included occupied.
Right.
So they're stripping away the context. They're making sure you don't have a rounded understanding of what's happening.
Yeah.
When you look at some of the ways, there was the ACJ case, right? That was in January, just beginning of the year. And the former Channel 4 editor actually called out Sky and BBC. And he said, "Why are you not showing this?
Yeah.
There are no international journalists allowed in Gaza because obviously Israel has restricted who enters.
Yeah.
This is a comprehensive and thorough kind of a presentation of the facts about what's happening. The Israeli officials and their genocidal intent, alongside how it's been carried out and the systematic destruction and annihilation of Gaza." And he said this should be shown to the public. But again, if you're shown that, you will reach the conclusion about what Israel is really doing. You won't have this kind of insulated and whitewashed understanding that Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel's being proportionate. It preserves and protects civilian lives. And, I go back to the spectrum. I'll give you another example with language. So the Times, this was a Times article 1 month into the genocide in November. And it said Israelis commemorate 1 month after 1,200 Israelis were killed.
Yeah.
And 250 hostages taken, which spurred a war in which 10,000 Palestinians are said to have died. So Israelis are killed, Palestinians die. Again, language is important because you're providing an image to the people. In other words, making sure that one is understood in emotive terms, and the other, how did they die? Well, that's up to you to decide. They weren't killed for all we know.
Yeah.
This is a recurring theme in terms of the passive voice, how it's described. One example from October was The Guardian. It had an article that Palestinian children were dehydrating to death because of a lack of clean water in Gaza.
Yeah.
The Financial Times in March, it said that starvation stalks the children of Gaza. I ask this, what's the reason for this? Well, because as Human Rights Watch have found out, Israel's using starvation as a weapon of war. It's violating international law.
Yeah.
As Oxfam have found, Israel is targeting water facilities, withholding water and not allowing water to come through. The deeper context, well, Yoav Gallant, defense minister, he said these are human animals, we're treating them as such, and impose a total siege, collective punishment, a violation of international law. So you're not able to piece together the reality. They're telling you that children are starving, that children are dehydrating, they're being killed from malnutrition and starvation, without adding the full picture. Because if you then are told the full picture, you won't understand it as well. Israel's being proportionate, Israel is defending itself. No, it's once again oppressing the Palestinians. It's once again deliberately and systematically, ethnically cleansing them and imposing collective punishment on them. And those are conclusions you won't reach if you only observe the media. So one other example in terms of framing and language, there was right at the beginning, obviously there was a lot of army veterans that went over to Israel, to the Israeli army that were called up. One of them was a 95-year-old who had actually been involved in the Nakba, and he was complicit in the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948.
Wow.
And he basically sent a message, and he was filmed saying, "We need to erase these. These animals must not be allowed to live." The Daily Express ran with an article which called his message a morale-boosting message for Israeli troops.
Wow.
So that's not what he said. And incidentally, that was clear genocidal intent. But the framing, again, you're not allowed that version of events. You're given a very diluted reality. And as we mentioned, the language, again, the same report, the Centre for Media Monitoring, they picked up on this in the first month. 70% of the word slaughter, massacre, horror, barbarism, 70%. Bear in mind, obviously, the 1,200 Israelis on October 7th, and in the first month, 10,000 Palestinians were killed brutally. And 70% of those terms were used exclusively regarding Israeli victims. So again, they're able to describe in vivid terms and explain what's happening. But for the Palestinians, it's a completely different rule book. There was a separate investigation which looked at BBC One's daytime coverage. There was 52 uses of the word murder, mass murder, brutal murder, and all of them used exclusively for Israelis.
Wow.
So again, while Israel commits a genocide, the media, the mainstream media, is ensuring that that story is not told, that Israel is just operating with self-defense. And when it does brutally massacre Palestinians, when it ethnically cleanses them, when it engages in mass slaughter, that the media is basically saying, I've got your back. We're not going to tell the story. We're going to ensure that there's level ambiguity about what happens. And we've seen this rinsed and repeated for the last year. And to kind of illustrate this, right, in terms of the different crimes that are committed. So there was a separate article recently in The Independent, which looked at the schools. It said Gaza's children enter second year without schooling. Which is fair enough. It's going to be a report about the state of schools. Israel's not mentioned in the heading or the subheading. Now, as you read through it, it refers to what's happening in Gaza as fighting or a conflict.
Yeah.
There's no mention that Israel systematically destroys schools, and that's a violation of international law.
Right.
There's no mention that Israel has historically done that. But there is room for the dominant Israeli narrative, which is that Israel actually is targeting schools because Hamas uses it as operating centers, control and command centers, tunnels, embeds itself within these schools without challenge that's mentioned. So we've listed a few examples from the press: the Daily Express, the Independent, the Financial Times, the Times, the Guardian.
Yeah.
To the naked eye, people,
left and right.
Exactly. People would argue, well, that different editorial guidelines, different approach, different audience, different approach in general. But they're not. In the end, they use the same tools. They use a passive voice. They omit context. They make sure that the reality isn't painted, and they make sure to withhold what's important. And they make sure when it is important, we can vividly describe and categorically explain to the reader what's happening. So if you look at the net outcome of all of this, now you've been told that things happen in a vacuum, that Palestinians just die, they just dehydrate. If they are killed, there must be a reason, there's a justification, because Israel is operating in response to October the 7th. It preserves and protects civilian lives. It's not occupying Gaza. This is merely two irreconcilable narratives between two warring factions, not a clear imbalance of capabilities. You've been drip-fed this information for a year, and obviously before October 7th, the same approach. And then the average layperson, for example, sees that Israel has targeted a school. Where is your mind going to go to? You're not going to go to, well, it's a violation of international law. You're not going to think it's, again, systematically pummeling Gaza. You're not going to think, well, hold on a minute, it's committing more war crimes. Your mind is going to go to where the media has guided you to go, which is there must be human shields. They must be embedding themselves. There must be tunnels. There must be control and command centers. They must be going after senior commanders. In other words, they lay the groundwork for Israel's crimes to be justified. And that's what we mean when we say the media is complicit. Without them, this would not be possible, because Israel needs, and the Israeli military needs, the media to sustain its narratives, to tell the tale on their terms.
I mean, this is really fascinating what you're laying out here. And, many have done that, but I think what you've done there is express just the travesty of how the media is in a sense controlled. I don't know if that's the right word to use. So let's talk about that. Like how does this work? Because of course you need some level of coordination. If you're going to create a media landscape that succumbs to the foreign policy objectives of the state or of the Western empire, of the Western, in this case, a settler colonial regime, you've got to have some level of control, or at least some direction from above, to make sure that these networks of newspapers, left and right, media organizations, are all saying the same thing. So explain how this works.
So the word lobbying is a bit of a dirty word in politics now.
Yeah.
It's everybody does it, right? The Saudis lobby, the Chinese lobby, the Russians lobby, the Qataris lobby. Everybody does lobbying, right? Because it's in your interest, to ensure that you are represented and your interests are represented in the political sphere.
Yeah.
when it comes to pro-Israel lobby, that's kind of taboo. It's the genie's out of the bottle somewhat now in the past year.
Yeah.
And we know in terms of the political level that takes place. In the media, there is also a level of pressure from the top. And I'm going to explain it using the admissions of people within that industry, right?
Okay.
So in 2011, there was a leaked email from BICOM. BICOM is a Britain-Israel Research Communication Centre, which its stated aims are to expand and deepen understanding of Israel and the Middle East in the UK, right? A euphemism for lobbying and effectively exerting influence and pressure.
Yeah.
It has, well documented, it has received logistical assistance upon its formation in 2001 from Israel's Interior Ministry.
Right.
So it had a leaked email in 2011 which boasted about the access that it had to BBC and Sky journalists. It boasted about how it had made them take the objectively favourable line on Israel. It boasted about applying pressure on Sky to ensure a certain narrative was taken.
Right.
If you think about that and you think about how that's effectively creating a culture where only one narrative is acceptable, and you think of the two cases we have today or in the last year or so, which was on LBC, Sangeeta Maiska, and LBC, Sangeeta Maiska and Sky News, Beldonati. And they basically pushed back against some of the lines that were being said by Israeli officials, and they were immediately being taken off air.
Yeah.
Who was Sangeeta Maiska replaced with? Vanessa Feltz of LBC, who back in November was with Peter O'Bourne on Talk TV, regurgitating the beheaded baby's claim, insisting that Israeli ministers have not expressed genocidal intent. So that suggests to you that, there is, even though this BICOM leaked email 2011, that strategy is still being mirrored. There is a level of influence, or at least a level of pressure, even if it's not deliberate, even if it's not necessarily someone telling you, you just know that you might, there are consequences if you speak out.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you talk about the delegations and trips of journalists to the Middle East, right? So this is something we know exists in the political realm with Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel.
Yeah.
So BICOM's head of Israel office, Jonathan Cummings, wrote a journal article in 2010, and he talked about how important these delegations were of the elite opinion makers in the UK, journalists.
Yeah.
And he said, we take them on these delegations to Israel because it creates barriers to the delegitimization that Israel endures and Israel faces, right? So they were, recognizing that if you take them to Israel and, brief them and give them different briefings and fill them in effectively with, insight from the Israeli side, they'll then regurgitate that, right? This is a journal article from 2011 from the head of the Israel office of BICOM. Just a few months ago, Declassified revealed, one of my colleagues, that a few journalists were taken on trips to Israel, right? Not necessarily about BICOM, but again, a similar strategy. One of them was a diplomatic editor of the Sunday Express. He wrote in a subsequent article how he'd had special briefings. He was on the Lebanon border and the Gaza border with Israel, with the Israeli forces. He came back, and what did he write in his article about what he'd learned? That Hamas uses children as human shields, uses civilians as human shield, that they use children's bedrooms for explosives, that they use schools, hospitals, mosques as terror centers. That is as crystal clear as it comes. You go on a trip, you get briefings, you regurgitate that and pump that into the mainstream, and you manufacture consent, you sustain narratives that suit Israel.
Right.
And this is, as I said, these are admissions and leaked emails and what people within that industry, people who have worked in that field, if you like, what they've admitted to. And this is obviously on a small scale in terms of the case study, but you can see patterns of behavior here. And you can just see in terms of when people do criticize Israel, you can see that they're almost given a slap on the wrist or even worse, taken off air completely. And you can see the dominant narratives that you read and you hear of within the media. And how many of these briefings take place, how many of these delegations take place of journalists to Israel. So you can see a pattern of behavior here. And as I said, there is definitely a pressure that takes place and a level of lobbying that is effectively impacting what we're being told and how people are being informed. And as I said, you're given a very partial and distorted understanding of reality and the facts on the ground because you've been effectively told by X, Y, and Z that this is the narrative, and you then, as an editor or as a journalist, you then pump that into the mainstream.
Yeah. I mean, I noticed in the UK, you do have some people who push back. Okay, you mentioned the LBC presenter Sangeeta Maiska, who was in effect taken off air because of her pro-Palestine stance. But then you do have people like James O'Brien, right? Now, James sometimes can be a bit too balanced, but on Gaza, he has made some very strong remarks, and he constantly calls out Israel for what it's doing. How comes people like that are tolerated in the press?
I think it's about the facade of balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
James O'Brien is a heavy hitter at LBC, and that's not to say Sangeeta Maska isn't. Her numbers were fantastic going into that I guess her suspension or the fact when she was fired, for all we know. I was surprised when James O'Brien, I listened to him a few times on the way to work, and he'd use words like ethnic cleansing, and I thought, wow, okay, the kind of the window is been moved somewhat.
Yeah.
But I think it's also about, my cynical approach to this is that it's about preserving the image of, look, we do accept a level of pluralism and freedom of expression, freedom of thought.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that come what may, when it comes down to it, James O'Brien will ultimately side, maybe not necessarily with Israel, but not wholeheartedly with the side of the Palestinians, right? Or at least he'll tell it, his solidarity will only go so far. Now, that's not to say what he says and how he exposes and how he informs and takes people to task isn't valuable. It is.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, it's to what degree. And he's one presenter out of how many on the channel who are willing to criticize. As I said, there's a line. He's willing to go up to that line, but not beyond. And he's only one of few, if not the only one.
Yeah.
So yes, give credit where credit is due, of course. But again, I always say that only goes so far. And unfortunately, it's not going to be those people who are going to expose, I guess, the system or the levers of the system, because he's ultimately a central cook of that.
So your point, I suppose, is there's this overarching narrative, and from once in a while, people like James O'Brien will be given some slack to talk, and that just gives the impression that there is journalistic pluralism. I mean, I noticed yesterday or a couple of days ago there was this Fox News journalist who reported on the state of journalism or journalists in Gaza and how they've been systematically killed, or at least he got close to saying that. And I was pretty surprised. I mean, this is a right-wing channel, very pro-Israel, yet they have this. So would you say the same for him? It's a similar type of, you have these oddities, but they're just that, oddities.
Yeah, like I said, credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
In that sense. But again, my approach on this is quite cynical. Where obviously he raised the plight of journalists. He mentioned that they need to be protected, that they're being systematically killed by Israel and deliberately.
Yeah.
But I look at it in a different sense. I think, well, journalism is not something you switch on and off, right? If you're able to raise that, if you're able to investigate that, if you're able to speak about that, why is there a switch where you then won't mention it again? If you're able to, then others are too.
Yeah.
But clearly that's not the case, right? So I'll give you a few examples. There was the first bombing of the hospital, Al Ahli Hospital, in October.
Yeah.
The Guardian and the Washington Post did kind of long, thorough reports on this. And mentioned they using open source intelligence and their experts, etc. They concluded this did come from misfired rockets from the Palestinian factions, Palestinian fighters in the hospital. That was their conclusion, right? And that effectively legitimized Israel's claims that A, it doesn't target hospitals, and B, that in future it may well have to target hospitals because of these bases that are being used. That was obviously proven untrue. That was an Israeli bombardment, an Israeli strike that flattened the hospital, and I think 300 Palestinians were killed that night. Some months later, the Washington Post then did an investigation, another one, and concluded, well, Israel is systematically targeting hospitals. But we knew that when you read your report. We knew that because Palestinian journalists have been saying that. We know that because of footage on the ground and what Palestinians have been documenting. But it's like a red herring. They can show you, we can investigate. And the thing is, this is multi-pronged. So another example is the New York Times. So it did a report in December, again, another thorough investigation, which looked into the 2,000-pound bombs that Israel was dropping on residential buildings and entire neighborhoods. And it concluded Israel was being indiscriminate in its attacks. It's telling Palestinians to flee, to go into, issuing evacuation orders and telling Palestinians to go to safe places and then bombing those places. In other words, they concluded from the report that Israel is operating with impunity, is being ruthless in its bombardment and very indiscriminate. So that's a New York Times report. So they've seemingly seen the light. I read an article a few weeks ago in the New York Times, which was titled "There is no childhood in Gaza," which basically broke down all the different, how children are being targeted. We know from what we've read, UNICEF saying children don't have the energy to cry in Gaza. Reading about the highest rate of child amputations in Gaza. So this kind of went through and how children are being targeted, they're being killed, etc. Their collateral damage in Israel's war machine. It then included the caveat, which the Israeli military claims that it doesn't target children, it doesn't target civilians, etc. So what was the point of that investigation some months ago, right?
Yeah.
If you're not able to use that, your own investigations change your mind. If it hasn't changed how you report or even how you critically challenge what the IDF tells you, what the Israeli forces tell you and their personnel, then what's the point? In other words, it is like a red herring. It's a bit of a gimmick, as far as I see it. In other words, you are able to switch on when you can be thorough, but your own conclusions that you reach don't apply to then those facts that you've uncovered and investigated and reported on, don't then impact the reporting that you're doing in painting the real facts. So it's like I said, it's when they suddenly take an interest and they start grilling interviewees, or when they start suddenly take interest in thorough investigations and showcasing and documenting what Palestinians have been saying all along, and then still not changing the narrative when they do their daily reporting. It's insulting more than anything.
When you were speaking there, it just struck me that, what's going on here? Why is it that they fail to address these issues as a long-term problem? And, so I sent out a message on Substack prior to on my newsletter prior to this conversation today, and I asked for comments, and one particular listener came back to me and said that, is it just simply racism? Like, is there a duality there, a hypocrisy there? Because they just, at the end of the day, they don't see Arab lives or Muslim lives or non-white lives to be of any significance. If this was happening anywhere in Europe, as it happens in Ukraine, maybe to a different degree, certainly to a different degree, the press is all over it, and they were mentioned, and there is a continuity, and there is some long-term thinking about one report and the next report, and they will make references back to those reports. You're suggesting here that it's all if there is a criticism, the criticism is very short-lived, and there's no continuation of that level of investigative journalism. So is it just racism here?
I think so. I think one part of it, yes. I think it speaks of a kind of hierarchy of humanity where some lives are considered. How you report on them is dependent upon their faith, their creed, their religion, etc. And we actually saw this play out with the attacks on Lebanon.
Yeah.
And if you remember the pager attack, which was a violation of international law, right? UN human rights experts said it was a terrifying violation of international law.
Yeah.
Amnesty International said it's a war crime that should be investigated.
Yeah.
And Human Rights Watch said that civilians were killed, medics, children. So innocent civilians were killed in this, which was, again, a violation of international law.
Yeah.
Some of the headlines on it was almost, they were praising this triumph. The BBC's international editor, Jeremy Bowen, wrote an analytical piece, and he called it a triumph. The Wall Street Journal talked about the success of Israel's intelligence. The New York Times, the tactical prowess that Israel showed. But civilians were killed. You wouldn't think so. And even the way they described it as Hezbollah pages.
Yeah.
No, these were pages used by ordinary civilians, not just Hezbollah.
Yeah.
So they look at the military side of it, the strategic side of it as as if these are just fodder. These are people to be, looked at. The same happened when they killed Hassan Nasrallah with the bunker buster bomb that they used. Yeah. And how that was described.
Yeah.
We've seen this countless times. The very first, one of the very first attacks on Jabalia camp in Gaza, one of the headliners of the BBC said senior commander killed, but there was 300 or so Palestinians that were killed at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's like they focus on military success and how this is revolutionary and innovative when there's civilians that are killed. But actually, like you mentioned, when Ukrainians are on the receiving end, when Israelis are on the receiving end, then they use the vivid language, the emotive language. There was an example actually. So as the strikes, Iranian strikes hit Tel Aviv or were targeted at Tel Aviv some weeks ago, I was flicking through the channels and kind of going to BBC, Sky, CNN, MSNBC. Yeah. I looked at CNN, and as I happened to switch on CNN, there was their reporter, and he was saying, well, this was targeted at Mossad, but as you know, this is a densely populated area, and civilians could be, they could be fatal losses here. They could be collateral damage, which would be wrong.
Yeah.
And I just thought that's a level of context you've never attached to Palestinian lives. So it's, as I said previously, it's not something you just switch on and off. It shouldn't be, but they do. They have depending on who is the victim and depending on who is the perpetrator, they have a switch that they just flick. Like this one is worthy of empathy. This one is worthy of telling the full story. Yeah. These ones, they're not. They can just be relegated as a footnote of irrelevance ultimately.
Yeah. So, you're on social media. You've got a very effective X channel, and you work for Declassified, and they're on YouTube. I'm on YouTube. I have an opportunity, a very small opportunity, alhamdulillah, but an opportunity nonetheless to fix and counter that narrative. And so is YouTube, is social media the panacea? Is that a sufficient balancer to this mainstream media? And when we talk about social media, of course, we've got the press barons of old, but of course we've got social media barons. Elon Musk, for example, who certainly has a very political position when it comes to not just this conflict, but every other, position that America is involved with, or every other conflict America is involved with in the world. Is social media enough of a corrective to this mainstream biased operation?
I think you can bypass it. I think, of course, it has challenges. The level of shadow bans and censorship and all the rest of it on social media, not just X or Twitter, but on Instagram and Facebook, all the rest of them. So there is definitely challenges to navigate there. But I think without social media, imagine the narratives that would be allowed to run without challenge if it wasn't for the social media. When we see clips every evening, every day, every minute from accounts, Eye on Palestine, and different people on the ground who are documenting things, we're able to piece together the reality. We're able to connect the dots and actually understand what's really happening. Whereas if it wasn't the case and we weren't having people that could bypass the mainstream media, and not just for us who are using it to inform or to educate or to expose, but also people who are consuming it, right? So if you're consuming, you see a refugee camp being flattened, you see the massacres that take place, and then you switch on, you've now seen at 2, 3 p.m, 4 p.m, you then switch on BBC News at 6, and they're describing it in completely different terms, as if it's two diametrically opposed situations. Then you start to piece together and think, well, something's not right here. We're being misinformed here. We're getting a very diluted version of what's happening, and so it contributes to a bit of an awakening. And I think there is that. That's definitely been really powerful and really helpful to have social media, to be able to have conversations, articles, and to expose what's really happening without having to rely on the mainstream avenues. And some of the views that you see, whether it's YouTube, whether it's other forms of social media, the views that you can generate in showcasing or capturing what's really happening and kind of informing and educating people, and that contributes to an awakening and radicalization, I think.
But has that worked? So are we seeing a shift away from Israel is good, Palestinians are bad in the West generally? I mean, I take it that if you're a Muslim, or if you're someone who's already invested in what is a genocide, what's happening. Those conscientious and courageous people who come out and march with us on a very regular basis, then you can see that, and it confirms in your mind what's happening. But in the large population, do we see a shift?
I think there's been something of a shift, or at least the process is still, it's still running its course. I would point to a recent example of a tweet by a retired Major Army General, Charlie Herbert. And he commented, this was on the 1-year anniversary of October 7th, and he said something along the lines of, I was appalled on October 7th last year, I was appalled by Hamas and their atrocities. 1 year later, I stand with the Palestinian right to resist, and I see kind of the full picture. That was kind of, I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically did this is, bear in mind, a retired Major Army General, this is somebody who is, you could argue, has been instinctively from early, there's certain narratives that he's obviously been exposed to and all the rest of it. And there's been so many different clips of people on marches and demonstrations and, who have been asked about this, and they say, I can't sit by. My eyes have been open to the reality of what's happening, and kind of I've seen the alternative. So I think we're in the very early stages, but there's definitely, I think, been, like I said, maybe an awakening. It might be small scale at the minute, it might be micro, but I think people are realizing, through the work of not just Declassified, but so many other people who are, documenting, exposing, capturing, educating, and opening people's eyes to the bias that exists in the media has tried to sustain for so long. I think that the genie's out of the bottle now. They can't put it back in. People have realized Israel's held to a different standard. Israel's treated by a different standard, and people are realizing, well, you're just basically whitewashing settler colonialism. And I can't justify that. I think that's the logic that people are now subscribing to.
I mean, do you foresee a time where Israel will be regarded as a pariah state, like South Africa, apartheid South Africa, was considered to be a pariah.
Potentially. I think
Yeah.
I don't want to say halfway there, but we're getting there. I think Israel is across, it's often reported as well. And I think it's always interesting what you read from what Israeli officials or Israeli kind of those within the inner circles. So there was an article in the New York Times which a Israeli official was bemoaning this and saying, we have to maybe think about how we are being treated, how we're being seen. That suggests it has cut through, and they are realizing in especially in the global south, if you look at the way that there are people boycotting, the way that people, you see people saying to Israelis, you're not allowed to die in here, etc. Whether your opinion on that is right or wrong, people are starting to see Israel through a different prism. And I think that's over here, especially, you see that the numbers we get for the demonstrations. I mean, 300,000 the other day.
Yeah.
So there is definitely something where Israel is being seen in different light, whereas people had perhaps bought into this narrative of the only democracy in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It's surrounded by hostile neighbors and it's always only operating with self-defense. Now they're perhaps seeing that Israel is a rogue state, Israel is a settler colonial state that terrorizes and oppresses its neighbors and not vice versa.
Yeah.
Which is obviously the argument that they try to present. So I think there is, just to South Africa, sometimes you think you're at the top and actually that's when your empire comes crashing down. And I think Israel's actions today do mirror that in terms of desperation of trying to cling on to what it had. And obviously it's waging war on several fronts and massacring scores of people, unfortunately. But I think we're in the process now, perhaps, of where Israel is starting to become treated, but very differently, and start to be viewed differently as an outsider, and that's effectively part of the domino effect.
Yeah, Hamza, tell me what do you get up to? I mean, I've described you as an investigative journalist, and you write for lots of newspapers, and I've read many of your articles, and alhamdulillah, I would really recommend these articles to our viewers to read. I mean, like what is it that you do to counter that narrative? Because I think that'd be quite interesting for our viewers to know.
Yeah, so we have this joke that people think how hard is it or how easy is it with covering this and finding things to cover and what do you dig into. It's actually quite easy because the mainstream media is leaving an avalanche of things untouched, right?
Yeah.
And people often say, well, we're just doing the work of what the Guardian, the Financial Times should be doing and their investigation.
Yeah.
But a few examples, right? So I did a piece on, there's an all-party parliamentary group. I found out about this. So it's called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Genocide, the Prevention of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. So it exists to prevent a genocide.
Right.
I didn't know about this, which tells you a lot about a group that's meant to prevent genocide, which nobody knew about 6 months into a genocide.
Yeah.
I kind of got a tip from someone. They said, look, you might want to look into this.
Yeah.
And I thought, I basically uncovered what's the reason that they're so silent as a genocide unfolds. Well, the chair is a Labour Friends of Israel member, Fleur Anderson, who's the MP, Labour MP for Putney.
For Putney, yes.
Who voted against the ceasefire.
Yeah.
You've got other members, Baroness Kennedy, who's a distinguished human rights lawyer, who wrote in several outlets about the importance of Israel defending itself post-October the 7th.
Yeah.
When there were numerous open letters and appeals signed by thousands in the legal field, judges, lawyers, etc., calling for a ceasefire, calling for suspension of arms sales. She wasn't one of them. There were other members who have attended receptions hosted by companies linked to arms companies linked to Israel. Others who had spoken openly against or tried to muzzle Palestinian solidarity. And these are the people who make up the members of this all-party parliamentary group. And so I basically put this out there, etc. And it was one of them things where it's like, why is nobody else covering on this? Why is other aspects of the media not holding our elected representatives to account? Surely the public should know that there's this group supposed to be preventing a genocide, doing nothing as the genocide unfolds.
Yeah.
And it's instances like that. Like another piece was on the Brits and the IDF. So I looked into British nationals who had gone over to Gaza post-October the 7th to fight with the Israeli military, or those who had already been part of the military. And again, this isn't some wow investigation. It was based off information that was online. So interviews they'd done with mainstream media, their own vlogs, their own blogs, what they documented online. That the fact they were celebrated on kind of Facebook accounts that encouraged people to move over to come from Britain or overseas to the Israeli military, etc. So just gathered information off that and, effectively named British nationals who were engaging in war crimes, because there were some of them openly filming themselves blowing up buildings, boasting about how they're going to destroy Palestinian communities, etc., laughing about it, using dehumanizing language of Palestinians, just basically putting this out there, look, these are British nationals. Because if you remember, other British nationals, when they go over and engage in crimes overseas, apparently that's the problem. Not so much when they're doing it for Israel.
Yeah.
And like I said, just things that the media should be doing, which is basically our approach, declassified, raising awareness. And I think one thing why I find this a bit easier to do, and I think journalism is obviously not a very diverse field, but I'm not interested in a seat at the top table. I'm not interested in rubbing shoulders with these people in the BBC, Sky and all the rest of them. And I think you end up self-censoring somewhat when you begin or when you start off, because you think, well, I want that Guardian column, I want that job or that gig at the Financial Times, at the Times, etc.
Yeah.
And you can't really criticize them as much. You can't be seen to be too outspoken. And I think that's an ongoing issue.
Yeah.
But as far as I'm concerned, these people are complicit in the massacre of my people. So why on earth should I be rushing and tripping over myself to have a seat at their table? So that's, I think, in journalism generally, I think there's too many people who are perhaps stuck in these organizations. And I'm not saying they should leave, because I know it's, everyone's got responsibilities and they have things to do and families to look after. But there are too many who are perhaps contributing to this or being cogs in the system.
Yeah.
For me, I can't justify that. But it just makes what I do somewhat easier, because I'm happy to expose if it's, the beheaded baby story I did. I happily called out the front pages of the Express, the Metro, the Telegraph, etc. Because I have no intention of later working for them. And so it makes it somewhat easier.
Yeah.
Whereas I think perhaps, just like we've obviously touched on this previously with politics, people sometimes want that seat at the top table and they want to kind of infiltrate and be part of that wider system.
Yeah.
And so when you think, well, why haven't you resigned? Why haven't you spoken up? Because maybe their ambitions are getting in the way.
Yeah.
And I think journalists and people that work with that declassified have the same approach. They're not interested in, being part of the system. They want to kick the door down. That brings down the system. And I think that makes it easier to then speak unequivocally and to showcase and expose and capture and investigate.
Leading on from that, I let you in on a little secret. And when I was 16 years old, I wanted to be a journalist. And it was sort of at the center of my mind. I wanted to sort of do reporting. And I had applied to work experience at lots of newspapers. And I had actually got onto some work experience. I came across a Muslim activist. And I sort of shared with him this idea of I want to be a journalist. And he responded to me by saying, useless. You'll never get a Muslim that will speak his mind, that will survive in journalism. Do something else, right? And so, and it was enough for me to say, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I dispense with my dream to be a journalist. What would be the advice you'd give to a younger person today who wanted to enter the field of journalism?
I think try and contribute and empower alternative media and kind of new media, because we have, especially now, I think perhaps wasn't the case 10 years ago or so, but especially recently we've seen, like as we mentioned with social media, you're able to amplify your work, you're able to bypass conventional avenues. And I think there is new media or alternative media is growing, and it's just about, I think, taking that risk. I know obviously I'm not downplaying how hard it can be to make that decision, of course. And obviously if you work for the BBC or Sky, Guardian or Financial Times, you have access, you have resources, you have a wealth of advantages that work in your favor in terms of, the mentorship that you'll get and who you'll be rubbing shoulders with and all the rest of it. But it just depends on where, I guess, not your priorities are, maybe your objective. Because as I said, new media now and alternative media is sometimes getting more hits, more likes, more...
Is there money in
That's
media?
the issue, yeah. So it's not as financially rewarding. You do have to take and make some sacrifices. But I think it all depends on where you want to go with it. So I've always kind of been critical. I've always been against the so-called establishment or the system. And so I find it, like I said, it's somewhat easier to engage and be part of a team that is happy to criticize and to inform from that perspective.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes people might take an interest in more local issues. People might take an interest in sport. It might be other forms of journalism. And maybe that's not where new media thrives or alternative media thrives as much. So I get there are challenges, definitely.
Yeah.
But I think just as we have done and we saw in the last year at the political level, how we mobilized, there was grassroots organizations and immaculate campaigns that were run by independent candidates, and how that effectively made a dent. Just we need to kind of mirror that approach for the media and ensure that we empower new media. And I'm not saying that as if it's easy, but I think we can more people can be informed, more people can be educated. Yeah. Basically, reporting is done without an angle, without a bias, without a kind of one-sided, partial perspective.
I mean, can I ask you about the money problem? Because of course, we do have, I'm just thinking about in the Muslim space, most of the Muslim media are very poorly funded. And as a result, the quality of their output isn't going to necessarily be there, not because there's a lack of will, but it's just they can't pay journalists and it's all done on a very shoestring budget. There must be people out there, of course, Muslim communities grow in and it's becoming more affluent and it's got monetary power. Why haven't we seen from within, say, the Arab community, the Palestinian community, the Muslim community, this effort to really put money into alternative media in a big way? At least in Britain, we don't see that.
I think it's a good question. I think that does need to be the next step, because I've been spoken with editors before, especially when I was starting out, and it would be like, can you write this? But unfortunately we can't pay.
Right.
And for me, I just wanted to get my name on it, so that's fine for me.
Yeah.
But other ones where you're being paid a much lesser rate than what might be elsewhere.
Yeah.
But then elsewhere doesn't fit with your narrative, or you're going to have your words minced and censored and all the rest of it. So there are challenges.
Yeah.
But I think, like you said, we need to empower, we need to fund, we need to build these alternatives, because like I said, especially in the last 12 months, it's crystallized, we need to have the stories told by the people that they're impacting. We need to have we shouldn't be signing up to censorship. And like I said, you don't want to be working somewhere where you write settler colonialism and it's changed to conflict, or, bombardment has changed to fighting. So that's obviously the challenge. And I think we're in a decent space at the minute in terms of good, viable alternatives, but how that is sustained and how that's maintained, like I said, we need to dig into community and ensure that is, it lasts the course.
Yeah. One final question for you. How do you rate, you talk about alternative media and new media. Of course, we've got Al Jazeera, we've got TRT, we've got Middle East Eye, and you write for Middle East Eye. I mean, you've got these publications, and to varying degrees, they're doing a pretty good job, right? And they do have money, and I suppose younger people can join those organizations. I mean, do you rate these organizations, or do you find that there is a similar level of censorship, maybe in different areas, but a similar level of censorship in these alternative organizations?
Yeah, I think they're examples of good journalism.
Yeah.
But of course, people, depending on what's being reported, could probably point out a bias of Al Jazeera, for example, or TRT or Middle East Eye.
Yeah.
And that's that's not for me to comment on.
Right.
But of course there is, naturally there is going to be, I guess, depending on who funds it, is it a state broadcaster, is it not? But if we're talking about the net impact, I think they've had a profound impact, particularly in the last 12 months. I mean, without those Jazeera journalists, right, without the likes of Hani Mahmoud, Tariq Abu Azoum, Hind Khudari on the English side, and then Anas al-Sharif on the Arabic side, and all the rest of them, many of them have paid with their lives. Without them, imagine the kind of narratives that would be allowed to run. Without them, imagine they're paying with their lives for documenting this.
Yeah.
And we've had some of the best reporting, or kind of the applying of context and piecing together the reality is done when when I'm observing and I see what TRT World say, or what something investigation I read in Middle East Eye, or Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera Arabic. There's a great new documentary by Al Jazeera which captures what the war crimes committed by the Israeli army, based on stuff they've posted, based on stuff that they've said.
Yeah.
So again, doing the work that you could argue BBC Panorama should be doing, or Channel 4 Investigation should be doing.
Yeah.
So without a shadow of a doubt, in the last 12 months, they have been indispensable. They've been really good.
Yeah.
And I guess you always have the question to grapple with in terms of who it's funded, what agendas run, etc., etc. But on the whole, I think there's far more positives in their coverage. And like I said, I think Middle East Eye is a linchpin now. It's a mainstay in the British media landscape. Got great columnists, great investigation. And I think they sometimes force the narrative, as I'd like to think we do at Declassified, where you force people to take notice of things, and you force the government to kind of respond to things, and you raise awareness about issues that the state, if you like, or the state media has tried to subdue. So there's definitely, I think there's a lot of value to them, 100%.
Look, Hamza Yusuf, Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for your time, and continue what you're doing. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for all the work that you do and you put into not just to Gaza, but your investigative journalism generally. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Appreciate that.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.